Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the first meeting of 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everybody to switch off their mobile phones and Blackberries as they do affect the broadcasting system. Item 1 is Declaration of Interests. Can I welcome Elaine Murray as a new member of the committee and invite her to declare any relevant interests?
Thank you, Convener. I can't really think of any particularly relevant interests that are not in my register of interests anyway, although perhaps I should draw attention to the fact I'm a member of Unite the Union, because that might be relevant at certain stages.
Okay, thank you very much and welcome. Agenda item 2 is Scottish-Ferry-Services, Ferries Plan 2013 to 2022. We are now going to hear from the Minister on the Scottish Government's Ferries Plan, which was published just before Christmas. This plan sets out the way forward for the next 10 years, and this committee is pleased to be able to question the Minister on its details. So can I welcome Keith Brown, Minister for Transport, and supporting officials from Transport Scotland, who are Graham Laidlaw, Deputy Director, Ferry Operations and Piers and Harbours, and Cheryl, Murrie, Policy Officer, Ferries Policy and Procurement from the Scottish Government. Minister, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Convener. If I could start by saying that we recognise, as previous administrations have done, that ferries are an essential part of Scotland's transport network. We're very clear about the significant contribution that our ferry services can make to the social, cultural and economic well-being of the country. And the quality of our ferry services impacts on all of us, affecting both island and mainland communities. And it's in recognition of those facts that we've carried out the first ever comprehensive review of ferry services in Scotland. The publication of the Ferries Plans is a significant step for the Government. It sets out the way forward for Scotland's ferry services, as you've said, for the next 10 years. The Ferries Plan focuses on how ferries should be funded and procured, on what basis fares should be set, what routes and services each community should receive, and who should be responsible for providing those services. It also considers issues such as accessibility and environmental issues. It takes account, of course, of the comments received in relation to a consultation on the draft Ferries Plan. We listened to all of the views that had been expressed following publication of the draft, and have also done some further work around our proposals. We've provided details of the significant steps we will take to improve the ferry services provided to each community, and also indicated when these changes will take place. We note, of course, that it's not possible to do everything immediately, but there is much that can be achieved very quickly. We've also provided an investment plan setting out the cost of making these changes. On the same day that the Ferries Plan was published, we announced that an updated RET formula will be applied to routes to the Western Isles, Coll and Tiree, and that revenue from this will offset fares increases for commercial vehicles on these same routes, following the withdrawal for commercial vehicles of RET. As an early illustration of our continued commitment to our ferry service network, I was pleased to announce earlier today £2.7 million of funding for 3 new port projects. First of all, vital maintenance work at the port of Tobermory can start. The work is worth around £600,000 and will support a number of local jobs during construction, but it will see concrete and steel work installed to the slipway walls, as well as masonry repointing. As part of our commitment to improve ferry services to Kerala, we're working with the community and with the council on a number of options to make long-term improvements to the ferry service and associated port infrastructure on the island and on the mainland. And this new funding will ensure that appropriate infrastructure is in place to match future services. And the second of our new cutting-edge hybrid ferry vessels, which is currently under construction at Ferguson Shipbuilders in Port Glasgow, is to be deployed on the Tarbert to Portavadie route, and we're working with the Harbour Authority at Tarbert Lochfine to adapt to the port to accommodate overnight berthing of the new longer vessel. Those projects are part of the Scottish Government's £205 million investment programme for shovel-ready schemes across Scotland to help deliver a building fillip to the industry. It's important, though, generally to note that the next 10 years, the outcome of this Ferries review and the publication of the Ferries Plan is really just the start of a process. We have to continue to review our approach to providing services and to continue to reassess the needs of our communities. And our intention is to do this every 5 to 6 years, or before the tendering of each set of ferry services. We want to ensure that communities continue to receive ferry services that meet their changing needs, but we also want to make sure that fare levels remain consistent and that communities and island economies can grow in the knowledge that there is continued certainty over the vital lifeline services, ferry services that they depend on. So we're fully committed to delivering first-class sustainable ferry services to our communities. We recognise, of course, the financial constraints under which we have to operate, but we do believe that the planned improvements set out in the plan will enable our rural and remote communities to thrive and to continue to make a significant contribution to Scotland's economy.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Obviously, the review was led by the Scottish Government, but there were many other people involved, and even from our mailboxes in the last couple of days, we've seen that many people have and do want an input into the Ferries review. So could you maybe give us a brief outline of how you went about drawing up this plan?
Well, first of all, of course, it was the draft Ferries Plan. It was published for a 14-week period of consultation. That was in December 2011. For that first draft stage, we had around 2,000 plus responses, and those were received both from organisations and from individuals. And we listened to all of those views that were expressed during the publication of the draft. We've also done some, as I said in my statement, some further work around the proposals. Things do tend to move on in relation to some of these issues, and that means that we've been able to make sure that the final Ferries Plan has contained some significant changes, improvements for the ferry services provided to each community. And I think crucially what we've also done is try to make sure that it has timescales attached to it. So you've got things which we intend to do very quickly, things which would happen in the medium term, and things which would happen in the longer term. And we recognise that some of those longer term commitments will be contingent upon finances and the outcome of future spending reviews. So it's not a case of just saying this is everything that we want to do and we'll do it when we've got the money. There are things, as I've said, pilots, improvements to services, extensions of services which are happening right away. The process itself threw up a number of concerns. I think you mentioned some additional correspondence that you've received as members of the committee and as a convener, and there are people that are still continuing to raise issues around the final Ferries Plan, which I think is expected, and will continue to engage with those communities and individuals.
And obviously there are issues relating to particular ferry routes, but were there any kind of overarching key issues raised that were pertinent to everywhere, really?
Yes, and those type of issues tended to be raised by organisations or very well-informed, even expert individuals. But things like the accessibility was an issue that came up across the network. The importance of ferries to economic growth was an issue, or ferries' role in providing effective social inclusion. The need for coordination and integration was something that came up across the whole of the network, and we have already said in relation to our rail proposals that we intend to oblige bidders for that to ensure further integration, not just with ferries but with buses as well. So those are some of the issues. Another issue, overarching issue, I suppose, is the question of infrastructure. It's quite clear there's not been the investment over previous decades to have the infrastructure in the condition we'd like to see it. So we have to have a plan in terms of infrastructure, not least where we're hoping to grow services. For example, Stornoway Ullapool will have a new, very substantial ferry, and that requires changes to be made to the infrastructure there. So infrastructure was an issue, an overarching issue that came up as well. Those are some of the main ones which came up.
The TIC committee in the last session held an inquiry into ferry services in Scotland, and their report recommended that any ferry plan should be accompanied by a fully coordinated plan for the replacement or refurbishment of vessels and any necessary upgrades to or replacement of ports infrastructure, and importantly a plan which should give confidence to ferry users that will be delivered. Are you confident that in this ferries plan that those recommendations are met, or do you think there needs to be a more detailed plan published?
No, I think those recommendations are met. I've mentioned already the financial pressures which were under capital budget cut by around 25%. everyone I think here is familiar with the general financial situation and the impact that's had on Scottish Government, especially in relation to capital. And that is a constraint we recognise is not going to disappear very quickly. Recent announcements by the UK Government have extended the period by which they think they'll have to continue to make those kind of constraints. So it is within that context, and also within the context that future spending reviews can't really be anticipated at this stage. So I think we have gone quite far in meeting those recommendations. The plan itself that we've put in the procurement plan identifies around 15 new vessels to come into service between now and 2025, worth over £295 million. And the first of these, as you know, was launched on the 17th of December by the Deputy First Minister, and that will be operational in the summer. Over the same period, up to 2025, we've also laid out investment plans for port and harbour works worth around £73 million, which will significantly enhance our ferry infrastructure to meet new vessel demands and service improvements. So I do think that there are certain uncertainties, if you like, in terms of future funding, which we're all aware of. But within that context, I think we've made a very good attempt to try and lay out what we expect to spend and when we expect to spend it.
So you don't have any proposals to publish a separate implementation or funding plan because it's so up in the air because of funding issues?
We did set out in the actual final Ferries Plan a fully functional and detailed investment plan, Appendix 1, which does give that kind of information on routes and services, proposals, vessel replacement and ports and harbour works. And I think that meets what the TIC committee previously wanted, and I think that's further than previous governments and administrations have gone. So that's what we intend to do, and we think that serves that purpose.
Gordon. Oh, sorry, do you have a question?
Very short supplementary. Minister, can you, for the benefit of the committee, just tell us what is the overall funding gap between the projects that have been identified and the funding that is currently available?
Well, it's not possible to say that, because what we are saying in relation to the short-term things which we intend to do is we'll fund that within the current spending review. So we've said that will be funded. I think there's also a degree of certainty. It's a bit like, I suppose, a weather forecast. It's more certain the closer you are to it, to make a topical example, I suppose. So in the medium term, we have some degree of certainty. We've not identified a funding gap. We are saying what we intend to do and how we intend to fund it. Obviously, if you have more funds available, there is more that you can do, or you can do things more quickly, but we've not identified a funding gap as such.
Just looking at the statement on page 10 of the ferries document, which said the level of investment identified is higher than current funding levels for ferries.
That's right, and that means that we're going to have to find that additional, we're going to have to find that money from within the resources that we have, but we're confident, in, as I say, in the short-term things which we're doing, that we will fund that from the resources that we have. It may mean that we haven't, it's not been identified to the last penny in all the budgets that we have, and there's going to be, as there always is, movement between budgets to make sure that we meet these commitments. But the early wins that we can have will all be, they're guaranteed we're going to do those. The medium-term ones, there's a degree of work to be done in terms of the budgets to make sure that we can deliver those, but we're confident we can deliver them. I think the less certainty we have is in the looking further out over the 10-year period. Obviously, if future spending reviews come in, depending obviously on things like constitutional change, and that would make a major change, because the borrowing ability of an independent Scottish Government would be substantial and would change things, I think, quite fundamentally. And we do have the view that borrowing to create economic assets is good borrowing, unlike some of the borrowing which has gone on at the UK Government. So I don't know if you want to say anything further in terms of the budget, Graham, but that's our approach just now. We will do the things that we said we're going to do in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just come back on that, Minister. I think it's just clearly we're working forwards with a programme level, making sure our budget's fully spent on the kind of key priorities identified, and that, and clearly, you know, as we go forward in future spending reviews, that this will be a kind of starting point.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask a question with regards to the finances? Has the priority being given to ferries changed within your remit? Because looking at the figures, when this government came to power in 2007-8, there was £85 million being spent on ferries. It's now in the region of 110 million and projected to rise to 180 million. Now, given the financial pressures we're under, that's quite a considerable hike. Could you explain why we're moving in this direction with ferries where everyone else seems to be getting cuts?
Yeah, I think there's two very specific reasons for that, and one more general one. And the more general one is I think the government has a real commitment to these services. We have seen an expansion of the services over the previous 5 years, and we're putting forward a further expansion of the services. Plus, there's no example I can think of within the final Ferries Plan of a contraction in services. So we have seen the services expand. But during the course of that time, of course, we've had the RET pilot, which is now being rolled out to other parts of the network. And that's a substantial investment in ferries. And it does recognise, I think, on the government's part, that these services are lifeline services, but in the past been allowed to be operated at levels which were punitive as far as islands and rural communities were concerned vis-à-vis the mainland. And RET, the whole point of it is to try and equalise that kind of cost. So RET is one reason for that. But a much bigger reason, of course, has been the increase in fuel prices. So much of what that figure that you mentioned of £180 million will account for. If you look at what we're actually paying to CalMac for the services now, that takes into account huge increases in fuel costs for the Northern Isles services and the Chief services as well. So, and yes, I suppose you could say if you weren't as committed, you could cut back the support to try and level off that increase in costs. But we are committed to the ferry services. So those are some of the specific reasons why the money that we put into ferries has gone up. But I think it is also part of a very genuine commitment to improving these services and making them more affordable for people in the islands communities.
Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. I just want to continue on this theme about the investment plans and relating to ferries, etc. CMAL already owns 30 ferries that are valued at 83 million currently. So therefore, this investment that you've got in the plan of 295 million is a substantial increase. It looks like it's going to replace about 50% of their fleet over that period of time. Given the pressure that is on the Scottish budget, I noticed that the latest boat being built for the Stornoway Ullapool route is under an operating lease from Lloyds Banking Group. And I'm just wondering, is this something that you're going to consider for future methods of funding the new vessels that you're proposing in the plan, or is this a one-off, or what other alternative methods of funding are there available to the government?
You're quite right. It's the first time that we've done this, and it is something that we've looked at because of the situation in terms of capital that the government has at its disposal, and the cuts which I mentioned previously around 25%. So I think of necessity we do have to look at different methods of funding. Our preferred method is still straightforward capital investment at the government's own hand, with the government picking up the tab for that, not least because it is nearly always the cheapest way of doing that. However, I do think it's necessary, and it's probably been necessary for some years now, to look at different options which are there. So we're not saying that this is how all procurement will happen in future, but neither are we saying that it's ruled out if we need to make an investment which is necessary for the network, and in the absence of having the capital resources available to do that. I think it's one way of doing that. I think it's crucial if we do that, as we've done in the Stornoway Ullapool, whereby Lloyds are actually procuring and building the vessel, and we're paying the leasing costs, that we have to ensure that we have value for money. That's obviously the main consideration, but at the same time, we know, for example, on that particular route, especially in relation to freight, that we have to make that investment. And if the only way we can do it is by looking at other forms of investment, we'll do that. So I would just say, I think I wouldn't read too much into that as being the way it will always happen in future, but it is one of the things that we can look at when we have to.
So basically, we're looking at this because of the pressure on the government. It's a lifeline service, and we've got no really other option in order to fund it. That's basically what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So the the current fleet of 30 ferries that we have, 17 were built in Scotland, 10 south of the border and 3 in Gdansk in Poland. And understand the new hybrid diesel-electric ferries, which is the world's first, are currently being built in Ferguson's yard at Port Glasgow. But the larger ferry for this Stornoway-Ullapool route is being built in Germany. Does Scotland not have the capabilities of building these larger ferries, say in the Upper Clyde?
I think we've seen over the past 30 or more years the diminution of the Scottish shipbuilding sector, and what we've seen is in relation to the contract for the hybrid ferries, which was an open procurement process which was won by a Scottish yard, Scottish shipbuilders thinking very seriously about the future projects which the Scottish Government might be able to afford. Of course, in relation to the Stornoway-Ullapool vessel, we are not procuring that. That's been done by Lloyds Bank, and it's certainly true also if you look in England and elsewhere that much of the procurement of new vessels is in Eastern Europe. However, if I can liken the situation in Ferguson's, where we have the 2 ferries coming forward, which they have won in a competitive environment, which is, I think, a vote of confidence in Scottish shipbuilding. If we can liken that to what's happened in relation to buses, whereby we've invested through the Green Bus Fund in an open procurement for very cutting-edge technology for our buses. That, in turn, has been won by and large by Alexander Dennis, who have developed an expertise in that area, not least because of the government's investment there, and they're now winning multi-million-pound contracts in that area for around the world. So I do think that what Ferguson's have done is a sign of real hope, and of course we want to see Scottish. I'd much rather, metaphorically speaking, of course, open a tender document and find a Scottish company has won that because of the impact on jobs. But the best way for them to prosper is to win these things in open competition because they're the best. That's what Ferguson's did in relation to those 2 contracts, and I'd hope that be more and more the case as they win these contracts. We've just seen a new contract, for example, in Rosyth for oil rig installations. As they win these contracts, it's vitally important they develop the efficiencies and the expertise which allow them to go on and win future contracts. But no government can guarantee that. You have to have regard to European procurement rules.
Moving on to the proposal for self-financing Harbour Authority capital improvements, can you outline how extensive the proposed changes to CMAL's harbour charges for the interim Clyde and Hebridean ferry service contract might be, and clarify whether these might lead to increased ferry fares?
Yeah, I think the intention is that they won't lead to increased ferry fares, but we do have a situation whereby, because it's the government by and large that pays these, because the biggest customer in many of these ports is the government, or the CalMac services which go into there. So the government can end up paying the bulk of the fees and charges which go to harbour authorities, and also being the guarantor for much of the capital work that goes on there as well. So I think it's necessary we make it more financially sustainable. But the intention is it will not result in an increase in fares to ferry users themselves, but it will better reflect the management and the maintenance of these facilities to CMAL. So that's what it's about, rather than trying to hike fares for ferry passengers, which won't happen as a result of those charges.
Okay, thanks so much.
All right. Elaine?
Thanks, Convener. Minister will remember that we debated the proposals for Loch-Boisdale service back in March, because there had been a significant campaign with about 1/3 of the respondents to the draft Ferries Plan expressing the desire for the reintroduction of that service. At the time we had that debate, Alex Neil, in summing up, said that the government would consult with the campaigners on the potential, the pros and cons, I think he said, of reintroduction of the service, or possibly trialling a service. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what consultation has been held with the campaigners and how the government has come to the decision that perhaps they are not going to introduce a trial or a reservice.
Well, the consultation, I think I've laid out what we went through in terms of the draft Ferries Plan and the final Ferries Plan and the responses that we received. I myself had gone to Barra and spoken to a number of people, including the Ferry Users Committee, some of whom were very much in favour of it. Some of them on Barra were very much against the idea, but there's definitely an opinion, a strong opinion there in favour of the Malach to Loch Boysdale ferry service, the changes which have been suggested certainly. So we do understand the strength of feeling and the representations which they made directly and through elected representatives as well. We understand the strength of feeling. But we did say that we had to look at this in terms of the current constraints we have financially, but to consider the economic viability. There's one interesting incident I had when going on a ferry from Liverpool to Stornoway, when I spoke to the captain and to I'm not sure what this next person down from the captain is, but the vice captain or the first mate or whoever he was, and they both had diametrically opposed views. The captain himself had experience of the previous service that was used on that route and didn't think it was viable or sustainable, whereas his colleague was convinced this was absolutely necessary and would be successful. However, in looking at it, as we said we would do, as Alec Neil said we would do, we've come to the conclusion that the only feasible way to provide the additional service would be to diminish services elsewhere or to provide an additional vessel. Now, the additional vessel for that route, it would obviously, the investment we'd have to make there would have to come from somewhere else, and we reckon that would be between £20 to £40 million of capital investment and a running cost of around £3 to £4 million per year. And that would be the case even for a trial, which was one of the points that the campaigners had made. Over the lifetime of that additional vessel, that amounts to around £100 million of public funding. Now, if you look at the services that we provide to the Western Isles, the various different points of departure and arrival in the Western Isles, we have a very substantial commitment to the Western Isles, but we didn't feel we could at this stage make that additional commitment. So what we've said, confirmed, is that we will consider the economic viability further at the time of deciding on the specification for the next tendered CHIFS contract. But we don't have that money to do that just now and don't believe it would be the best use of that money given the demands on the network elsewhere.
The possibility of different funding arrangements. We've already heard about the operational lease from Lloyds Bank. Did you look at that type of possibility?
Yes, I mean, you could. It'd just be a question of the profile of the spend rather than saving money on it necessarily. And of course, if you did it in that way, then at the end, you wouldn't own the vessel. The person you're leasing it from would own the vessel. And it'd be very expensive. I don't know all the detail of that, but very expensive to procure a vessel for a trial on a lease basis. Obviously, whoever's leasing you that vessel knows they've only got a short-term lease for it, so that would be expensive. So we don't believe it was the best use of scarce resources at this time, but we haven't ruled it out looking at it again in terms of the next CHIFS contract.
Ferries Plan does look at a number of pilot routes or additional services such as Campbellton and between Campbellton and Ayrshire. I wondered if you could maybe say a bit more about how you would assess the success or otherwise of these pilots and how the decisions would be taken, what sort of consultation regarding decisions as to whether they should be continued or cancelled.
Well, I think that the obvious way, maybe ask officials to respond to this as well, but the obvious way would be in terms of patronage, how much use we have for that, how much demand is there. And obviously in agreeing to those pilots, in distinction, contradistinction, if you like, to the Malik pilot that was suggested, we've looked at the cost of doing that and the current vessels that we have, and we believe it's possible to use within the current vessels which you have to provide that pilot over that period. So we will look at that, we'll look at the running costs of it and the fare box that comes in as a result of that service. Crucially, it's whether it's used. I mean, it comes in, Campbelltown, it's going to stop in Arden and then go on to Ardrossan. It's a question of whether it's used. Ardrossan, because you have the rail link directly there. If, as local people have said, there's a demand for this service, then if that demand transpires, then that will be the main factor. But as to the more technical way of evaluating the service,
I think that covers it. I think clearly we're looking at the detail, the carryings and what the kind of revenue take is, whatever. All the services are loss making, so they'll all require subsidy. But clearly, the key issue is, does it get traffic off the road? Is it used? Does it link Campbellton? Does it provide connectivity for people and businesses in the Campbellton and the broader entire area to link into Ayrshire and the rest of the Central Belt and beyond?
It's worth mentioning two other things which are not directly related to the ferries plan, but related to our thinking on this. Campbelltown has no ferry service currently, but we've also announced at the same time as the final ferries plan that there'll be additional weekend journeys by air as part of a new contract to Campbelltown as well, and also that we're looking now at the trunking of the road between Kennecraig and Campbelltown, currently obviously done by the local authority. And I think it is part of that philosophy which I'd mentioned in response to Adam Ingram's question, whereby we believe it's very important that that community, Campbelltown, has a range of services which allow it to carry on its business, whether it's for social or economic reasons.
Finally, you mentioned in your introduction to the at the beginning of the session the need to sort of review services every 5 or 6 years. How will you respond? How can the plan respond to sort of changes in demand which might be happening over that period if particular businesses' interests appear in particular islands or whatever? How would you? How flexible is the plan? How are you able to make the sorts of changes that might become necessary for unforeseen developments over the period of the plan?
Yeah, it's a good point. The Ferries Plan obviously lays out what we intend to do over the next 10 years. There's a substantial degree of flexibility in it. Some of the proposals for changes we've said will be subject to local consultation. And I think it's also true, as you say, that if something crops up, you know, a major new investment in an area could change the configuration of travel there, so we have to be responsive to that. But I think the difference now is, as a result of going through this ferries planning process, we now have a methodology developed by those who know how to develop methodologies for evaluating all the routes. So in the ferries plan, every route has been evaluated in terms of whether it's primarily a lifeline service, or whether it's a freight service, or whether it's a tourist service, or a combination, as it usually is, of those things. So having that methodology in place, if you suddenly have an apparent demand that a service should be looked at again, we now have a methodology to test that against, and that will give us a flexibility to respond to that. Of course, it will always depend on funding being available to make those changes, but we now have, I think, have the tools in the toolbox to make that evaluation.
Alex.
Thank you very much, Convener. I wanted to go on and look at the plans for fare structures in the future. And as we all know, there was many in the road haulage industry who were very disappointed when freight was dropped out of the ambition for RET. Could I begin by asking when you expect to publish the final freight fares policy? And can you give us an indication of what that might look like?
Yes, I can in broad terms, and I would be asked if I was to come in here in this as well. We have said that if somebody was to look at the fares structure up to this point and for previous years of the network, there is no rationale that would explain it to you. You couldn't start from a point and saying this is how you could explain every fare. Riddled with anomalies, and what we think is very important for consistency and also for accountability is that we have a structure which all has a starting point. So in future all fares will relate to all passenger fares will relate to RET, which is not the same as saying that every fare on every route will be an RET route, but they'll all have a reference point to RET, so there's a rationale, an objective rationale for how we arrive at our fare structures. I think in relation to the commercial vehicles, RET, we carried out the pilot as we said we would. At the end of that, it was our belief, based on the surveys done by Halcro, that those savings weren't being passed on to customers, to the end user, and also to some extent, and this has been covered in the subsequent report that we're looking at, which is not finalised yet, so I'd rather not comment on that until it is finalised, the issue of whether all it was doing was masking increases in fuel costs, for example. So I think that's the further report that we did was on the basis of the economic impact of having withdrawn RET from commercial vehicles. What we've done in relation to that in the meantime is extended RET to a number of vehicles, for example, up to 6 metres, vans up to 6 metres, which has been helpful, to other parts of the Western Isles. And the Western Isles has been treated differently because it was where the pilot was carried out, and so they're coming from a different place. We've also put in place substantial transitional funds, several hundreds of millions of pounds hundreds of thousands of pounds in relation to subsidy to manage that transition back to non-RET fares. But our thinking on that is that the RET pilot had a huge beneficial impact on the Western Isles in terms of passenger carryings, in terms of tourist carryings, but not the same benefits in terms of commercial vehicles. So our future fares policy will be based on RET, not for commercial vehicles, but for domestic passengers. And what we're working through just now, the next stage in this will be the report which I've mentioned on the economic impact of the withdrawal of RET. That is one of the milestones in arriving at a new fares policy for commercial traffic. I don't know if Graham wants to say more on that.
Just to pick up on that, we've got the work ongoing in that. In fact, I chaired a meeting of the working group yesterday representing a whole series of interests: Freight Transport Association, Road Hauls Association, Western Isles Council, Gailand Butte Council, Outer Hebrides Commerce Group and others. So that's ongoing, and Minister said we'll hope to get that report finalised and published shortly. And then there's a commitment in the Ferries Plan, obviously, to take forward a fundamental review of commercial vehicle fares, and I see that study and that report, when completed, feeding into that, and then as quickly as possible then setting up a working group with stakeholders along the lines I've outlined for the other group, to take that work forward and hopefully take that work forward fairly quickly, because clearly, you know, and then come up with a methodology or approach on fares, and then like an implementation plan for that. Because clearly there's a huge variation in the structure of commercial vehicle fares between obviously the Western Isles, where we had RET, other bits of the Clyde and Hebrides network where there wasn't RET for commercial vehicle fares, and comparing that with the Northern Isles services, which are in a totally different rationale altogether. So there's no overarching consistency, and what we want to try and get to is some overarching consistency. So there's a fairness and transparency for that for each community involved.
It's certainly easy to detect a fear among the road haulage industry and others that if fares were set too high, it could have a significant impact on island communities and economies. From what you're saying, are we safe to assume that you're aware of that?
I think, I mean, that was part of the rationale behind the pilot as well, to see what benefit it would have economically in terms of the islands. Now, there's different views on this, I concede that point, but our view was it didn't have the impact that we thought it could have had in terms of people actually receiving goods in the Western Isles at cheaper rates because haulage prices had come down. That's not to say that the hauliers were grabbing the money for themselves, but they were perhaps covering other increases which were taking place. But again, as I say, that will be covered in the report. But the straightforward answer to your point is, yes, we're very well seized of the idea that higher fares can have an economic impact on remote areas and islands in particular, and that will form a large part of our thinking as we go through this process.
On a slightly different issue, the plan raises the idea of demand management and the possible introduction of premium fares on certain sailings. How will the development of demand management be taken forward, and can you give us an assurance that any such measures will not impact on the ability of low-income islanders to use the travel arrangements that are in place?
Yes, and I think the plan also says, from memory, it's got a pretty strong commitment in there to make sure that local communities are consulted on this. So it will be for the operator in the first instance to look at demand management, the company that wins the contract. I actually think that demand management, if done in the right way, will improve the ability of those on low incomes to use the service. What it's seeking to do, as with the railways, is to make sure that the better use is made of the facility, so it's spread over a different period of time. So the ability to manage demand so you don't have the perhaps inevitable peaks and troughs that you have can help people make sure they can get access to services which they might find problematic in the meantime. The idea is not to use this as a process for getting additional income in. That's not the government's purpose behind looking at this. It's to manage the traffic which goes on to those services, and I think that makes perfect commercial sense, and if done in the correct way, it will be to the benefit of local people. And as a safeguard to that, the plan lays out the fact that no operator will be able to go and do this without having the substantial buy-in of local communities through the consultation process.
Looking at RET fares, the plan indicates that there will be an annual review of RET, and it will be updated according to a formula in line with the cost of travel. What does this mean? And is it possible that fares could increase at a rate above retail price inflation?
What it means is that the idea behind the road equivalent tariff is obviously to make travelling by ferry equivalent to what it would be if you were travelling by road. And that's our way of trying to equalise the costs to people in remote communities. That's our chosen method of doing that. Given the fact that's what it is, and based on the cost of travelling by road, and that the cost of travelling by road changes, each year, it's only right that we uprate that if that's what prices are showing us. It's the only way to make it sustainable. I think that's fairly obvious. The mileage rate that we use is used by Transport Scotland is based on independent research published by RAC and DFT. So it's going to be in line with the cost of travel. It's the most objective way we can find of doing it. I suppose it may open up the possibility of it being higher than inflation. It also opens up the possibility of it being lower than inflation. I think that it's a road equivalent tariff, and that's how we intend it goes forward. So it's based on the equivalent road prices. And as we all know, sometimes those can be greater or lesser than inflation.
So we can see a situation where the annual review will be one that's greeted with a welcome or disdain in the same way as rail fares are.
It's not the same as rail fares, although with rail fares you'll know that we've announced recently in the next franchise that we intend to bear down on increases, actually to have lower than inflation increases for off-peak travel, depending on the rate of inflation. So it simply is the fact that the biggest determinant, I would imagine, of changes in road travel will be things like fuel costs and taxes. Now, if we have control over them, then of course there will be a different calculation, but these things currently increase or otherwise a rate that we don't have any control over. But they do increase. So there's an increased cost for the road user. If there's an increased cost for the road user and their whole purpose is trying to make it an equivalent cost for ferry users, it's only right it increases at the same rate.
Elaine?
Just wanted a brief follow-up on the situation with RET for commercial travel. I mean, I appreciate that the Minister doesn't necessarily wish to discuss the interim report of the MVA consultancy, although that is available to many people, including myself, and some of its conclusions do seem to be in conflict with the Halcro survey. When we debated this in Parliament in February, I think it was, Alec Neil made a commitment to a review once of the transitional arrangements in light of the, I think it was this particular report, the MVA consultancy report. I wondered if you could maybe give us any detail as to when that review might be taking place and how it might be conducted.
Yeah, and I know this is a bit complicated in relation to this, but the review which you mentioned previously on general fares is going ahead according to the timescale which Graham has outlined. I think what Alec Neil was referring to from memory was to get back to the pre-RET prices would have been a big hike. I mean, RET for commercial vehicles when it came in was a huge drop for many hauliers, and to get back to the pre-RET prices would have been an equivalent hike in rate. So we sought to mitigate that by providing transitional relief when it first happened. What we said we would do is discuss with the hauliers and others how we manage the next stage of that, which could have resulted in increases of up to 50% in their view. The hauliers felt there could be increases of up to 50% this year. So they asked us, I met with them in Stornoway and some in Barra as well, and they've been in communication, asked us to look at this in advance of that change in prices coming in this year, which we've done, and we've limited those to the same increase as will be applied to passengers because of what we've just been discussing, the annual uprating of RET to around about 10%. The same is true for passengers as it is for a haulier. So we've met that commitment to review that. They asked us, they said they would find it very difficult to cope with an increase of around 50%, not surprisingly. It's turned out to be about an average, slightly below in some cases, 10%. So I think we have met that commitment to review the next tranche of increase for the hauliers.
What he'd actually said was at the end of the transitional arrangement we will review the position in the light of the results of the study which we will carry out with the hauliers. That's actually happened, is it? That's
the process we're talking about before. The study which you're saying you've seen is the copy you've seen must have draft on it. It's a draft report and that's why I'm not commenting on it. But that study is the next part of the process. It's being discussed just now. Once that has been discussed, there is going to be the review, as we've been discussing up to now, of
the final report's due this month, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. But just to go back to Graham's previous point in response to Alec Johnson's question, that's what we're going on to, a general review of commercial fares across the network. That's where we're heading with that.
Okay, and I hope you'll send the policy to the committee when it's available. Jim.
Thank you, Convener. The Ferries Plan recognises that there is no single mechanism for providing ferry services across the network, the extensive network of ferry services. I was interested to know what discussions the Scottish Government has had, given its commitment and willingness to take on and assume responsibility for ferry services, what discussions it's had with local authorities and ferry operators with a view to assuming responsibility for ferry services.
We've had a number of discussions, some at political level and some, the bulk of them at official level, with 3 island authorities, Argyll and Bute, Orkney and Shetland. Different circumstances obtain in each of those, and in some cases the local authority believe that it's at least possible that these services can be delivered more effectively by the Scottish Government because of the larger network and the ability to deploy vessels in different ways when you have that kind of resource. So we have had fairly substantial discussions with Argyll and Bute, and I mentioned before some of the investment we're making in Kerala, which is a service not provided by the council, provided privately, but which doesn't provide the certainty that local people are looking for. So discussions in relation to that service have been not just about the ferry service, but about the infrastructure, and not just the port infrastructure, but the infrastructure on the island of roads. So there's just things to be done by the local authority, things which can be done by the government if we take that over. And those have been progressing, I think, now for some months. In Orkney and Shetland, it's a little less certain. In Shetland, there has been a view expressed that it might be desirable for the government to take these on. I saw a statement from the ferry spokesperson on Shetland Council saying they wouldn't be doing this if this was going to mean hikes in costs and so on. Well, all we're doing is responding to their request. They've asked us to look at this, so we will do that and do it in good faith, and that's going on. And it'll be Shetland Island Council's decision as to whether that happens if the internal ferry services are to be taken on by the Scottish Government. In Orkney, I would say we're generally a bit more advanced. There's been more discussion in relation to that. The particular issue that they have in Orkney is the capital costs of investment in their infrastructure, vessels and harbour facilities. So they've been talking to us. As to where we're at, it has been something that's been agreed politically. We'll have these discussions, but it's been taken on by the officials. I don't know if Graham has been leading that.
We've made significant progress with Orkney Islands Council at official level, and just kind of discussing whether they would, the process involved for allowing them to make the decision about whether they would wish to transfer responsibility to Scottish Government. But as the Minister says, one of the key issues for them is the kind of the funding of their vessels. Continued funding of their vessels, and that is something that will be considered within the discussions that we have with them.
Clearly there are a number of factors that inform the decision-making process before a decision to transfer is taken. Funding is obviously critical among those, but are there any other factors?
I think sometimes in Argyll and Bute it's the views of local individuals about particular services, how they can best be provided. There is also another view in some areas that they like to see the services provided by community-based organisations, not as part of a larger network. The biggest issue, I think, is by and large funding. Now, if we currently, as we do, fund councils to provide ferry services, and if we provide the ferry services ourselves, that's obviously going to change the funding that we make available to councils. So it is complex, but I think at the same time it comes down to an essential decision. The decision-making structure will be, do the council want to agree this? The council will have their own process for agreeing that, and then the Scottish Government will say, based on what we've agreed, yes, we'll take those on. I think it's worth also pointing out the other part of the decision-making process is in relation to the ferry services generally. One of the reasons for having the interim contract for the CHIFS network is because that contract, if we take on these services, we're probably most advanced in relation to Argyll and Bute as well, rather than the Northern Isles, then the contract will look quite different from the previous contract. So there is some discussion ongoing just now. I would say it's quite positive with Argyll and Bute, and I think we'll end up in the right place with them.
That's very helpful. Can I ask you a separate question on the issue of ferries regulator? Government has stated that, and I quote, "We have concluded that there are strong arguments against the establishment of any additional regulation of ferries." Can you tell us what those strong arguments were?
Yeah, first of all, the fact that in order to create a regulator would rely on the UK government to take the initiative in relation to some of the legislation that's required. And the indications we'd had from the UK government is that they were not willing to do that. They weren't willing to see further regulation. That was a crucial consideration. I think also we do have substantial regulation of ferry services just now, not least through the contracting process and the tendering process that we have. However, there are still some fears in local areas about the way that services are provided. I think in particular, perhaps a fear that a monopoly service may leave passengers and users paying higher prices than they otherwise would, or having a less general service than they would otherwise like to see. So what we've said in the Ferries Plan is we're looking to establish that objective kind of analysis by looking at an expert or advisory group. There are a number of people in Scotland who are very expert in ferry services. We in Scotland, of necessity, have developed a large expertise in providing ferry services. So I think the ability to tap into that more objective viewpoint in relation to how ferry services are working and how they can work better, we intend to take forward in that way rather than through the creation of a regulator.
So you're not in favour of a ferries regulator, but you are keen to ensure that the system of regulation is as robust as it can be, and to that extent you will keep this under review?
Yeah, well, we do know that in order to legislate for it, we can't do it ourselves in any event. And we know the UK government doesn't seem to be willing to legislate in that area. So what we're trying to see is what benefits we can get that a regulator may provide. A regulator, I suppose, in theory, you could say could step in if they saw a monopoly emerging, but there are other means of dealing with that, you know, through various regulatory agencies. So the other things that you could get from a regulator, we're looking to provide those by this other means, and we think that's likely to be a more sustainable solution.
Okay, Adam.
Thanks, Convener. You responded to a question from the Convener early on about accessibility being an overarching issue across the network. Perhaps could you tell us how the government is responding to that, and in particular, can you provide more information on the size and scope of the Ferries Accessibility Fund, and whether you expect such a fund to continue after it's reviewed in 2 years' time?
Yes, we do. I think the point would be that accessibility is not something which should be guaranteed by that fund. Accessibility should be happening in any event in terms of every time we procure a new vessel or we build a new facilities, accessibility, as is required, should be built into that. I think, though, that inevitably we're dealing with a network which is at different stages, at different ages as well, if you like. So the idea behind the Accessibility Fund is to go beyond those legal requirements, and we're quite determined that it will not become the way in which the ferry operator carries out changes that it's obliged to carry out in any event. It will go further than that. So that's the thinking behind the Accessibility Fund, which we intend to create. If you want to say any more, or is it Cheryl that would deal with that?
Either of us, both of us. Clearly, you know, we've done a lot in trying to identify that kind of key issue. Clearly, you know, you've got a kind of aging population. You've got a population with increasing mobility, access issues, whatever. So we want to make sure that the ferry services are open and available to all, and the ferry companies and ferry design, whatever, has been taken forward. And we want to make sure that that continues. So the issues of accessibility, for example, new vessels we're building, whatever, are now much more able to deal with access issues for different levels of mobility, visual impairment, people with audio disabilities, whatever. We can cover all of those issues, whatever, much more favourably, whatever, in a vessel design by putting those things in from the outset. And likewise, when it comes to redevelopment of piers and harbours, much more attuned to the needs of those with accessibility difficulties. So clearly, that's kind of going forward with new infrastructure, new vessels, whatever. But clearly, there's the legacy going back decades, if not centuries, whatever, of Piers, Harbours that clearly didn't care for that with steps and whatever. So that's something going forward, and clearly for recently Northern Isles ferry service, we put in much stricter, much more stringent controls and improving access, for training for staff, making sure they're more aware of the issues, onboard toilets and all the rest of it. So clearly much more has been done, and much more can be done, and clearly we see this accessibility fund as a way of further enhancing and developing that.
So it's a kind of retrospective remediation that will focus on.
Cases it is, obviously going forward we'll make sure we design these things in from the outset, but clearly, you know, trying to address some of the legacy issues that we're left with.
How are you going to establish the... my understanding is the Scottish Government will provide CMAL with the resource for this particular fund. So how are you going to establish the scale of resource required for it?
As I say, required is probably not the correct word. There are things which they are required to do. They're going to have to do in terms of legislation. It's very similar in a way to, again, the railway network, whereby they will have legal obligations on what they have to do in terms of accessibility, but they do have a legacy of things which don't match common day requirements. So you have the, I think it's the Awards for All, maybe confusing that with another fund, but they have the fund which is administered by Westminster, which we input to say we think this particular project on a railway bridge or a station waiting room is required. So we pitch into that. That's going over and above. So what we'll do is we'll establish the fund for the ferries around 2014, have it for the 2 years that you mentioned. It will be Scottish Government grant, but we're not averse to looking at contributions, obviously, from either the operators or CMAL themselves, or even at developing into a charitable trust eventually as well. But I think it's likely to be necessary that we put the funding, certainly the bulk of the funding in initially. But this will be over and above what they are legally required to do.
Okay, Margaret.
Good morning, Minister. Environmental issues. The strategic environmental impact assessment that accompanied the Ferries Plan concluded that there was potential for an increase in the emission of greenhouse gases resulting from an increase in car traffic volume, taking advantage of the rollout of RAT across the network, and also increased vessel traffic due to the increase in both vessel movements on existing routes and a number of vessels. How will the Scottish Government, or how does the Scottish Government intend to offset the negative environmental effects resulting from the proposals in the plan, particularly increased greenhouse gas emissions associated with the rollout of the RAT fares?
I think we intend to address that by both a combination really of shorter term and longer term measures, and also we are not the only actors in relation to this. For example, the European Commission and the European Union have now prescribe certain changes to the emissions which ferries make in terms of sulphur in particular, so that there have to be substantial changes made by operators of ferries to reduce those emissions. Something which is vexing the industry to a large extent, but they're now obliged to do that under European legislation. So from our point of view, I think we will try to influence where we know we can influence. So first of all, short-term measures like emission reductions, focusing on fuel consumption and making sure that the vessels which we have are more fuel efficient. In relation to that, I've mentioned already the two new vessels which we have, which are hybrid ones, which will reduce emissions. Interestingly, we haven't taken this that far forward yet, but we've recently heard about a hydrogen-based ferry service in Bristol, I think it was, which I'm told when they put the hydrogen power unit in and took out the engine, they had to put further ballast in because it had taken so much weight out of the engine. So obviously, if hydrogen-based systems can work, they can affect huge changes in the weight of vessels. Now, we do have a hydrogen-based project initiative in Aberdeen in relation to buses, which also includes the production of the fuel in the first place. We haven't yet taken that further forward in relation to ferries, but the Bristol example, I understand, was what's called a pipe cleaner project, by which is meant there is no regulatory framework for approving and designing the hydrogen-based system. And in order to create that, you create a pilot which then goes through a system. So it's a kind of pipe cleaner project. So that possibility, as well as I've said, the hybrid ferries which you've mentioned, and as the fleet is replaced, making sure it is much more fuel efficient, fuel management and vessel replacement and the use of alternative fuels, I think are longer term, but those are the longer term ways in which we will be seeking to address the carbon footprint of the ferry services that we have.
You probably answered part of my question. Gordon MacDonald's also asked earlier on as well, but when you're looking at replacing the ferries, you're sort of piloting the hybrid ferries just now at the moment. Will you be looking at implementing that type of ferry when you're replacing the old stock? Or the carbon ones that you've been talking about?
I think as we replace the ferries, then, I mean, for example, another example would be the Stornoway-Ullapool one. The fuel consumption figures on that will be, I think I might say, substantially better than, for a start, that's one vessel replacing two. You've got a freight service and an old vessel there, the Murrie, and you've got the passenger service. So it's one vessel replacing two, and it's a bigger vessel, so it can carry more, but that'll be more fuel efficient. So I think if the point of your question is, as we're going through replacing our vessels, we're making sure they are more efficient and less environmentally damaging, yes, we're doing that now, and we'll continue to do that more in the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, anyone else got any further questions? All right, thank you very much for that, Minister and your officials. I suspend the meeting to allow changeover of witnesses. Okay, the third item of business today is Forth Road Bridge Bill. We're going to hear from the Scottish Government's Bill team on the Forth Road Bridge Bill. This is our first evidence session on the bill and is for the committee to seek clarification on the provisions of the bill and associated documents. So I welcome the Scottish Government's Bill team, who are David Thomson, Bill Officer, Raymond Convill, Bill Team Officer, Graham Porteous, Head of Special Projects, and Susan Conroy, Principal Legal Officer. Can I invite one of you to make some opening remarks, please?
Thanks very much for inviting us here today. I'm Graham Porteous, Head of Special Projects at Transport Scotland. The Raymond Convill is the Bill Team Leader, David is his Supporting Officer, and Susan on my left is the Principal Legal Officer from Scottish Government. The Forth Road Bridge Bill was introduced on the 11th of December 2012. Supporting information was also published on that date, notably the Policy Memorandum Explanatory Notes, the Financial Memorandum and a Delegated Powers Memorandum. A Business Regulatory Impact Assessment and an Equalities Impact Assessment have also been published. A full strategic environmental assessment was undertaken for the Forth crossing. As this bill will have a negligible impact on the local environment, we haven't done one for this part of the bill. Transport Scotland will, however, specify within the contract documents the minimum requirements on the bridge operating company in relation to environmental responsibilities. This is a relatively short bill, some ways technical, dealing as it does with trunking, maintenance, the organisational status of FETA and the TUPE regulations. I can assure the committee, though, that Ministers, the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland fully appreciate the impact that the changes will have on the lives of the FETA staff who are drawn from the local communities who work on the Forth Road Bridge, particularly as many of them have long years of service there. Any changes in respect of an employer, career progression and pension rights are very real and can't be underestimated. The principal aim of this bill is to enable the most cost-effective and coordinated approach to the management and maintenance of the Forth Replacement Crossing and the Forth Road Bridge. Scottish ministers believe that a single contractor carrying out the management and maintenance of the two bridges and the adjacent connecting trunk roads will achieve cost efficiencies, and holding a procurement competition is the only way to truly test the market to prove value for money. The provisions of the bill will trunk the Forth Road Bridge, trunk the road over the Forth Road Bridge, transfer FETA's assets and liabilities to the Scottish Government, dissolve FETA and transfer FETA employees to the new bridge operating company. In line with ministerial objectives from the outset, the bill paves the way for the procurement process to take place. It will protect all of the FETA staff, retain the skills, knowledge and professionalism of the staff, as these are all greatly valued by the Scottish Government. As with the wider Scottish Government approach, there will be no redundancies. Subject to parliamentary approval, the bill's commencement provides for the simultaneous dissolution of FETA and transfer of its employees. To allow for the management and maintenance arrangements to bed in, and in order that the new bridge operating company can become familiar with the Forth Replacement Crossing, commencement of the new bridge operating contract will be in advance of the opening of the new Forth Replacement Crossing. I hope these opening remarks are helpful, and if there's any other information that the committee needs, we will try and provide it.
Okay, now move to question. Adam, I think you can start.
You've touched upon some of the provisions in the bill, but could you perhaps outline what the key provisions of the bill are and why they're necessary?
The key provisions of the bill are to trunk the road over the Forth Road Bridge so that responsibility becomes Scottish Ministers as Roads Authority. The second provision is to make sure that all the assets that FETA currently own, land, buildings, vehicles, etc., transfer from FETA over to Transport Scotland. That results the third provision of dissolving FETA. There's also delegated powers that are transferred to us in terms of the bylaws and the transfer of the FETA employees.
And they're necessary because we need to presumably coordinate between the new crossing and the Forth Road Bridge. Yeah, there has to be a maintenance company in place to maintain the Forth Replacement Crossing.
It's a new bit of road, new sections of motorway either side. So in order to pave the way to get a procurement competition, we have to trunk the road to take responsibility for it.
Perhaps there'll be questions on that a wee bit later on. Could I ask what consultation has Transport Scotland carried out on the proposals in the bill? And can you explain why there's been no formal public consultation exercise?
The provisions of the bill are tightly defined and technical rather than broad and conceptual. But as I mentioned earlier, importantly, they affect individuals. Transport Scotland is of the view that continuous consultation with targeted stakeholders throughout the project, from policy development through the legislative process into the implementation of the policy during the dissolution of FETA, is more appropriate and inclusive than a one-off written exercise. As the bill affects specific groups, we have method and frequency of stakeholder engagement has been tailored to meet the specific needs of individual stakeholder, which was the purpose of our communication with them. For example, we've worked with FETA to identify the options for future maintenance and management. We've met with FETA staff to discuss their concerns, and we've met with community groups on both the north side and the south side.
So, could you maybe specify what the main issues raised with you during that consultation were and how you responded to the concerns raised?
The main issues related from the staff related to the pension provisions. They are totally accepting the fact that they're going to a new operating company. Their terms and conditions are protected, but what's not protected under the legislation is their pension provision. Under TUPE, a new company would have to provide a broadly similar pension arrangement, and that was obviously causing a bit of concern. So we took that on board and have been away and discussed the matter with the Lothian Pensions, and we have decided that the best option for the staff was to get the staff to have their pension stay where it is, which is why we're going to write into the contract that the successful bridge contractor will apply for admitted body status. That essentially means that the staff's pension remains unaffected, and they will stay with the same amount of terms, same condition, same length of service. So the pension in effect is untouched.
And I just want, and as I understand it, the Scottish ministers are acting as a guarantor for that admittance to the pension, to the Lothian Pension Fund as well. So that's an additional commitment as well, which was made to address the concerns of the staff.
In terms of community councils, when we met with them, they were understanding of what we're trying to do. They were particularly excited about the having to have clear lines of communication and how would we deal with that. And we were obviously able to explain at the Forth Bridges Forum as part of that. They were very excited about the potential for having an improved visitor centre. As things stand at the bridge, there's very little for visitors to do, so there's a huge opportunity there for something to happen. Very little in the way of bridge users. It won't affect bridge users as such.
And I think another feature was the timing of it as well, which was important to try and establish these arrangements quite early on so that people knew where they would be in years to come as well.
Very much.
All right, Gordon?
Yeah, you've already touched upon the staff issues, and you've said that that staff will be transferred under TUPE, and there is this issue about pensions that have been safeguarded. But how many staff are affected by this? 72. I understand that there are safeguards for the short term for when this transfer takes place. But is there any safeguards to people's pay in terms of conditions in the longer term?
Yes and no. Nobody's guaranteed a job for life these days. I think that's an accepted fact. But the company who takes over the responsibility for the bridge has a duty to employ the staff that are there at the moment. That contract will have a set life, It'll be a specific period of time with a series of add-ons, and at the moment I envisage I'll have a set of add-ons at the end. So, for example, the typical sort of contract we do as a maintenance contract will have a 5-year duration with a series of add-ons at the end of that, perhaps 2 plus 2 plus 1, taking it to somewhere around about 10 years. At the end of that period of time, staff who are employed on that contract at that point in time would be entitled to pay transfer over to the next company, okay, by way of safeguarding their jobs. What we will endeavour to do at that point in time is to make sure that anybody who is a FETA original member of staff who has transferred from now, if they are still in existence and still in employment with the bridge operating company, something would obviously happen to their pension at that point in time. So the idea will be that in however many years' time it is, we will write a provision into the following contract that would protect the original FETA members of staff's pension at that point in time.
Okay, and so over a period of time there will obviously be a churn of employees as people retire or move to go to other employment. So will any new staff will they be employed in the same terms and conditions as existing FETA staff, or will that be up to the new operating company what new employees' terms and conditions will be?
The company, it'll be up to the company. We won't be asking for them to take any. Nobody else will get admitted to the Lothian Pension Fund other than the existing FETA staff. There's also the possibility, as we've explained to the staff, that the company who takes over could offer to buy out their terms and conditions, which is a standard practice. So they could be given or offered a cash enhancement to transfer from FETA into their new company's pension fund.
That was really what I was getting at when I asked the first question, but yeah.
Right, okay.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Yeah.
Can I add on a couple of points as well, just to addressing your point as well? Graham mentioned the figure of 72, and that's current staff, but I think there's also, as you suggest, there's existing pensioners as well, and my understanding is I've got a figure of active members within current active members as well, so I think I've got a figure which is 60, so then there's a 60, then there's a 72, and then there's more people as well, the previous employees as well. And I think also in terms of future as well, I think I'm right in saying that is for the future contract as well. So once if the contract is retendered in the future, that same condition, I believe, whereby they will continue to operate, continue to be part of the FETA pension, the Lothian Pension Fund, that will continue as well. I think I'm right in saying that.
Okay, thanks.
Elaine?
Thanks. The bill transfers ownership of FETA's assets to Scottish ministers. Is it feasible that some of these assets might be further transferred, say, to a private sector bridge operator?
No. The intention is that the land, we will retain ownership of the land. There may be items like small plant, etc., which is disposable type plant. If a lorry's getting to the end of its maintenance, there's no any point of us keeping a particular vehicle. But certainly the fixed assets, land, property, that will stay with us.
Could you, FETA had other responsibilities other than management of the bridge. It could use revenues, for example, according to the Scottish Executive back in 2002, to fund public transport alternatives, roadworks, traffic management measures and other schemes. How would these issues be dealt with following the dissolution of FETA?
Every responsibility for that sort of thing would fall to Transport Scotland.
Right. The next issue I wanted to raise with you is possibly a little bit tangential, but it was raised with me last week, and it was in regard to the sad issue of people committing suicide from the Forth Road Bridge, and I wondered just what sort of safety precautions would be implemented on the new bridge and indeed on the old bridge to try and prevent suicides through people jumping off the bridges.
With the new bridge, there's no pedestrian access because it's a motorway, so you wouldn't have the same sort of problems with people going for a walk and jumping off a bridge. The existing bridge setup won't change as a result of the bridge operating company taking over, because the intention is that the control room staff that are there who monitor the bridge for things like suicide jumpers will stay, and these people will just transfer over. They'll still do the same job, albeit it's for a new employer.
Alex.
Convener, can you outline how Transport Scotland intends to develop, let and manage the contract for management of the Forth Road Bridge and the Forth Replacement Crossing?
Yeah, the contract will be based on the existing 4G contract. That's the current maintenance and operation of the trunk road network. We've already been through several iterations of that. We're now on version 4. Currently, it's just recently been let for the West Coast. We'll use that as our base document, taking on board any lessons that have been learned and any observations. Transport Scotland are quite experienced at tendering contracts, and it'll be me that'll tender the contract. I'll be responsible for the tendering of the contract. We're developing the contract documents, as I say, based on 4G. Now, whilst that will take care of the roads on either side, and we do have bridges, other bridges that we maintain, the likes of Erskine Bridge, Keswick Bridge, the Kingston Bridge are all similar. The fourth bridge section of it will base the part of the contract documents on the fourth replacement crossing on the information supplied by FCBC, the bridge constructor, and will base the fourth road bridge section on information supplied by FETA staff out there. At the moment, we've employed Halcro as our consultant engineer to develop the documents. They've done 4G anyway, and they're working closely with the FETA staff to prepare, get an operation and maintenance manual gathered together so that all of that will be put into the contract.
So you're at a fairly advanced stage then in the preliminaries of putting together that contract?
We're getting there. I've got a deadline to work to. I've got to be ready to go to tender by June.
But there's nothing particularly novel in it, that,
no.
Would that be fair to say?
No, it's fairly straightforward.
Okay, thanks very much. Paragraph 22 of the policy memorandum highlights FETA's view that it is important that some local accountability is retained in light of the impact of the bridge works on the local community. Can you outline how relations between any new bridge operator and the local community are likely to be managed?
One of the things that we will be doing is writing into the contract that the contractor is responsible or will have a duty to go and consult with local people and hold regular meetings. Engaging with local communities is obviously very important, and we have to do it in all of our contracts. This one, although we've got a local community adjacent to us, we do it on all the contracts. We are working hand in hand with FETA to see what they do at this point in time. Whatever they do will be written, a similar provision will be written into the contract. For example, if they meet on a monthly basis with a particular community council, we'll replicate that in the contract so the new contractor has to do that. We're also, in terms of making sure that they do liaise, we'll make sure that the contract will include other provisions such as community initiatives. So, for example, the 4G contracts that we have at the moment have a provision in them that the contractor has to go and have a minimum number of community initiatives in any year. It also has to have community engagement in terms of projects with schools and colleges, so the contractor has to go and do that. Probably somewhere in the region of 4 projects a year. There also has to be a development opportunity provided. We'll also have the Forth Bridges Forum, which is a separate entity that's already set up, so that they will also engage with local communities to make sure that the contractor's doing what he has to do. There's also an audit function that we have as another contractor, PAG, who are an audit group. They will actually come in and audit to make sure that the bridge operating company, they do it for all of the contracts. So if, for example, there's supposed to be 4 community engagements, they will check, we will check, and they will check as well, and not wait till the end of the year to see have 4 of these been done, have you met with the community councils. It's done on a monthly basis. So at the end of month 3, if they should have had a meeting with a community council and they haven't had it, we'll be making sure that's rectified.
There is a formal set in terms of reference for the committee, for the forum as well, so we can certainly pass it on to the committee if you require that too.
Okay, Margaret, did you want to come in?
Yeah, can I go back to the procurement process, if you don't mind? And I'd like to ask you, what within the procurement requirements are you going to be looking at community values and any requirement for to look at employing maybe people that have been unemployed but have the skills required to do the work that you're procuring for, and also is there going to be any requirement or commitment to take on apprenticeships as well within it?
That would tend, whilst I can appreciate your question, there will be a specific topic within the procurement stage where we will ask the contractor what he's going to do. But we will have already written into the contract a minimum requirement that he has to provide. Transport Scotland has a fairly good record. I think it's got an excellent record of making sure that local people get jobs, making sure apprentices get jobs. The M74, for example, which was completed recently, now I know that's not a maintenance contract, that was a construction contract. At the height of construction, employed 900 people. Over 70% of them were from the Glasgow postcode. They also, there was 15 apprentices employed as a result of the M74. All of the contracts that Transport Scotland issue are doing that. The fourth replacement crossing has a similar set of provisions. I don't know the facts and figures for them, but they're reported on a monthly basis. We will write into the contract that all of any vacancies that come up in the Forth Bridge contract have to be advertised in local job centres. The 4G contract has a provision that 10% of all new recruits must get an apprenticeship or a training facility. Now, that's based on an annual, for example, we'll specify for an annual spend of £10 million per annum, there's a certain minimum that they must achieve. Now, it's obviously impossible to say year on year that we will employ new people, because if original people don't leave, there will be no vacancies. So that's covered by virtue of the fact that what we say is either 2 new recruits or 2 existing staff members. And I'm saying the numbers here are, for example, either 2 new staff or 2 existing staff members will be trained up to SVQ level 2. 1 new member of staff or an existing member of staff will receive professional training. Also, we'll be saying that there's got to be 3 work experience places provided per annum per £10 million worth of spend. So that's already written in. So that, and what we'll be looking to see is if any of the tendering companies can better that, we'll put that in as a minimum requirement.
Jim?
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask what assessment has been made of the potential impact of the proposals in the bill will have on the users of the Forth Road Bridge? I'm thinking particularly of cyclists, pedestrians, those who use public transport, given the bridge's future and continuing use as a public and active travel corridor.
There should be no change to the users of the bridge. As a result of this bill, they will see nothing because it just stays exactly as it is until the new Forth replacement crossing opens. All that happens is it's a different management contractor, and they should do exactly the same as is happening at this point in time. Going forward, when the Forth replacement crossing opens, obviously the traffic becomes much less in the existing Forth Road Bridge. It will be buses, taxis, cyclists, pedestrians. The biggest concern that we got raised was how are we going to continue to make sure that cyclists and pedestrians get across in windy or foul weather. And again, there will be no change to that because as things are, FEDA arranged they gather cyclists and pedestrians at one end of the bridge because in winds above a certain speed, I think it's either 40 or 50 miles an hour, you're not allowed to walk over the bridge. So they gather these people at one side and organise for one of their vehicles to take them over. It's not like a regular service, but if they get 3 or 4 of them, they'll take them over. We'll replicate that as a condition in the contract. It'll actually be in the bridge operation and maintenance manual, which will be part of the conditions that the new company will have to operate.
That reassurance is most welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
In terms of the options for management of the bridge, I understand that Transport Scotland and FETA considered 3 possible options for the future management of the 2 bridges. Option 1 was FETA continue to manage and maintain the Forth Road Bridge while the Scottish Government appoints a separate company to manage and maintain the FRC. And option 2 was a single company to appoint and manage and maintain the FRC and the FRB. And the third option was responsibility for managing and maintaining the new Forth replacement crossing is delegated by the Scottish Government to FETA, in addition to the responsibility for the Forth Road Bridge. Can you explain why ministers chose the option that is presented in the bill, that is option 2?
We do have an answer to that. Would you just give me a minute?
Okay.
It was seen as the most cost-effective way of being able to ensure that the bridges, both bridges, were maintained and being able to prove value for money. The various options that were looked at were discounted because they couldn't happen. Do we have anything written on that? To have two separate companies do the contract, you would have more expense to do it that way, because you'd have operation and maintenance costs for two companies when one could do it. It's obviously more efficient to have one company doing both. If we'd left a new company doing the new bridge and FETA doing the existing bridge, the FETA wouldn't have needed as many staff as they currently have, because there'd be far less work for them to do. For example, quite a lot of their staff are involved in doing traffic management on a nightly basis. Every night there are cones out on the Forth Road Bridge because there's work to be done on it. Post the new bridge opening, that wouldn't happen because there's so much less traffic. So the traffic management staff, for example, wouldn't be needed. So if we'd gone for two separate companies, there would have been redundancies in the FETA company. We couldn't have had FETA tendering to do both bridges because they are a fully funded government organisation, and if they'd used government funds to tender for a contract, it would have constituted state aid and we would have breached procurement rules. So the decision was reached that by far the best option, which FETA support, is to go for one company looking after both bridges.
Okay, and the final business and regulatory impact assessment of the proposals in the bill confirm that the cost associated with option 3, which was FETA take responsibility for both bridges, were not assessed. And you've given the reasons why that is. Given this, though, how can the committee be sure that the proposals in the bill do represent the best value for money?
But that will be as a result of the procurement competition, because it will be the lowest winning competitor based on a quality price bid will be the one that gets awarded the contract. So we're able to prove that we're getting the most cost-effective bid.
Okay. Gordon, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a quick question about how we go about safeguarding the standards of maintenance on the bridges. You mentioned earlier the PAG report on the analysis of standards of work, the latest one, 2011-12, when it talks about electrical safety, which is covered by the certification BS 7671. It says North East Bear performance is dipped to fair, non-compliance with BS 7671 for M90 Friarton Bridge, South East Bear, overall Bear's performance is dipped to fair. No certification was available for the Kincardine Bridge. North West Scotland Transerve performances dipped to fair. South West Amy, overall Amy's performances dipped to fair. No certification was available for the Erskine Bridge. So given that this certification is important for the electrical assets, and that all of the performance units so far have dipped to fair, how do we stop that happening on the Forth bridges?
The operation of the maintenance contract is not something that I'm an expert on, but based on previous experience, Bear will have been taken to task behind the scenes for that, and we would expect that whilst you could expect that one report would have a dip in performance, I certainly wouldn't expect the next one to have a dip in performance. If it has, discussions will take place at a fairly high level I certainly wouldn't expect to see a second one.
Will there be penalties in the contract so that if, you know, performance does dip, then, you know, there are penalties that will affect the company?
Personally, I don't like the penalties approach. There certainly will be a mechanism whereby they don't get money. To take money off of somebody and penalise them is a dangerous area to go into. I understand the concept that you're coming at, but in effect, what will happen is they won't get paid for something rather than having to pay back money for not having done something.
Anyone else got any questions?
Sorry.
Yeah.
The issue of best value, you've said that option 2 represented best value for the taxpayer, but given the previous answers that you've given, if I've heard you correctly, because of the state procurement rules that apply, we haven't actually tested option 3. We don't actually know that option would or would not have been more cost effective than option 2. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, just remind myself what option 3 was.
FETA would continue to have responsibility for the Forth Road Bridge in addition to its existing responsibilities.
Take on the Forth.
Take on the Forth.
The replacement trust.
Yeah, the FETA couldn't just get responsibility for the new bridge. There would have to be legislative change, because the way they report at the moment to FETA board is made up of several councillors. So you would have an odd situation whereby you've got Transport Scotland responsible for the road, but the bridge, FETA being responsible to a different reporting regime for the existing Forth Road Bridge. So you'd have a section of trunk road that was a motorway. Also, one of the other difficulties is the new bridge. Whilst the FETA, great guys, are really experienced, they're really experienced at what they do in the existing bridge, but the new bridge is a totally different type of structure for which they don't have the experience of. It's not all steel the way the bridge is, so there would have to be other skills brought on board.
There may well be very sound reasons why the government has opted for option 2, and it may well be the most cost-effective option, but what I'm seeking to understand from you is whether option 3 has actually been tested in terms of its cost-effectiveness, or has it been excluded because of the state procurement rules that apply?
I think what I'm going to have to do with that is, can I come back to you with a written answer on that one? Because off the top of my head, I don't know, and it's not fair to try and read through notes, and I wasn't involved in the process. So I'll come back to you with a written answer on that, if that's acceptable.
Absolutely, thank you.
Anyone else got any questions? Okay, that's fine for now. Thank you very much for coming, and I very briefly suspend to allow the witnesses to leave the room. Okay, if we move on to agenda item 4, which is public petition, consideration of public petition PE 1424 from Joyce Harkness on improving transport provision for older people in remote and rural areas. Does anyone have any comments on this public petition?
Elaine, yes. Yeah, I'm familiar with the piece of work. I know the group of people who undertook it. from the Dumfries and Galloway Third Sector Forum. It's an interesting piece of work. It was actually the surveyed service uses by putting out surveys in to older people's groups and putting them in GP surgeries and so on, just to get some sort of picture, and quite a concerning picture indeed, about access to health and wellbeing services in a fairly remote rural area. Some of the examples, certainly in Dumfries and Galloway, of good practice are also within the community transport sector. So I think the idea of incorporating this into the community transport inquiry would be very sensible, because I think actually it would reveal both the bad and the good in terms of what could be done. Can I also agree with the recommendation that we should seek an update from the Scottish Government, because it looks as if the final report on the Audit Committee report should have gone to ministers by now, and that the pilots should have been being sought last month and this month. So it would be quite useful to know whether or not the timescale was being adhered to on that.
Okay, so does everybody agree with the recommendations in the paper? Yeah. Okay, that is agreed, that's fine. Agenda item 5 is subordinate legislation. We've got 2 negative instruments as listed on the agenda on variable speed limits on the M9, A90, M90 and M9, A9. The committee is invited to consider any issues that it wishes to raise in reporting to the Parliament on either of these instruments. There have been no motions to annul received in relation to these instruments, and the Subordinate Legislation Committee didn't raise any concern in relation to these instruments. Does anyone have any comments on it?
Nothing, no objection or otherwise to the instruments themselves. It's just that the whole idea of variable speed limits is something that is relatively new. We're bringing it in a number of roads at the moment. It might be something we want to look at in future, just to get some feedback on, to see how successful or otherwise it has been.
Fair point. Okay, apart from that, do we agree that we don't wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments? Good. That more or less completes our business for today. Our next meeting on the 23rd of January will consider the Water Resources Bill at Stage 2, and we'll hear from Sandra White on her statement for reasons on her proposed responsible parking bill. And the clerks will also be emailing members to arrange visits to Forth Ports, Babcock and the Forth Crossing Project, especially the new visitor centre there. And can I remind you that there will be a roundtable private discussion with the David Hume Institute on procurement on Wednesday the 30th of January at 11 o'clock. And we haven't got any formal business scheduled for that day, so hopefully that'll be fine. And members have been invited to the Institute to attend the seminar at the RSE on the previous evening. Did you want to say something? Okay, close the meeting.